Good day and welcome to the June Pacific Northwest DEWS Drought and Climate Outlook webinar. My name is Britt Parker and I am with the National Integrated Drought Information System at NOAA. This bi-monthly webinar series hosted by NIDUS, the USDA Northwest Climate Hub, and the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute is designed to provide partners and other interested parties in the Pacific Northwest with timely drought and climate information. Excuse me, each webinar will be tailored to reflect the recent, current, and forecasted conditions and climatic events, but will also include discussions of observed impacts and other relevant updates from across the region. Webinars and recordings and other supporting materials will be posted on drought.gov later this week, and if you're signed up for our emails, you'll get notifications once those are available. After today's webinar, you'll have the opportunity to provide feedback that will help us improve this webinar series. So please take a moment and let us know what you think. Today's speakers include Karin Bumbaco from the University of Washington and Office of the Washington State Climatologist, who will give us our climate recap and current conditions. And thanks, Karin. I think this is your second month in a row, so you're definitely done your due diligence for us this year. Joe Casola will then speak on the seasonal condition and climate outlook, and Joe is with the NOAA National Centers for Environmental Information, Western Region. We'll then have two speakers who are going to really focus in on public health and mental health. So Rachel Lookadoo from the University of Nebraska Medical Center will talk about a drought and public health roadmap and messaging research for public health providers. And then Cassie Buska from Oregon State University Extension will talk about farm stress causes and implications, and also provide a couple resources to you. Before we begin the presentations, we wanted to highlight the partners who make this webinar series possible. The Northwest Climate Hub develops science-based region-specific information that will assist agricultural and natural resource managers with climate-informed decision-making in Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. You can visit the website, which will be placed in the chat box for more information. OCRI is a network of researchers at Oregon's public universities who work with public and private entities to advance understanding of regional climate and climate adaptation. The Oregon Climate Change Research Institute is administered by the Oregon State University and hosts the Oregon Climate Service, the Office of the State Climatologist of Oregon. To find out more, you can also check out their website in the chat box. NIDUS was established in 2006 by public law with a mission to improve the nation's capacity to proactively manage drought-related risks by providing those affected with the best available information and resources to assess the potential for drought and to better prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. NIDUS is building the foundation of a national drought early warning system through the development of regional DEWS, where networks of partners and stakeholders share information and actions that help communities cope with drought. While the ultimate goal is a national early warning system, we recognize that impacts and early warning information differ across the regions. Each DEWS has many of the same base ingredients, but ultimately have their own flavor to reflect the needs of the region. The Pacific Northwest DEWS was officially launched in February of 2016, and our strategic plan and information on current activities is available on drought.gov. To facilitate our early warning system, more precipitation observations are needed. We encourage you to join CocoRoss, the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. This is a unique, nonprofit, community-based network of volunteers of all ages and background working together to measure and map precipitation to include rain, hail, and snow, as well as condition reporting. Observation by CocoRoss observers of precipitation events or the lack thereof are important to capture and improve our understanding of weather. To become a volunteer or learn more, visit cocoross.org or contact your state coordinator, and we'll list those names and emails in the chat box. And finally today, we want to welcome the new Washington State Climatologist. Dr. Guillaume Auger has been named the next director of the Office of the Washington State Climatologist. His appointment began earlier this month, and we've worked with Dr. Auger on many efforts, but we look forward to working with him in this new role as the Washington State Climatologist. And thank you to Karin for serving in the interim. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Karin to kick us off with our climate recap and current conditions. I have to find you on a long list.
Okay.
Sorry for the delay. Here we go.
Does that look okay?
It has not come through yet.
There we go. Great, thank you. Thanks so much. Karin Bumbaco, Office of the Washington State Climatologist, and thanks for sharing our exciting news about a new state climatologist. So I'm going to jump right in here. First, what we're going to do is take a look at what our temperature and precipitation have been doing for the water year as a whole. So this is going back to October of 2023. On the left-hand side, these are our temperature anomalies, so just through last week. And we can see that overall, the Pacific Northwest has been on the warm side, so mostly temperatures between 1 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for several months now since the start of the water year. Looking at the rankings just through May, we are, much warmer than normal compared to the long records going back to 1895. The water years ranking as the 7th warmest in Oregon and Idaho, the 10th warmest in Montana. Of course, we're only really concerned about Western Montana in the DEWS region, but the state as a whole is above normal for the water year. And then the 13th warmest in Washington. So temperatures have been on the warm side. Precipitation is more varied throughout the DEWS area, but overall, we're seeing more near normal to below normal precipitation for the water year, especially across the northern areas of the Pacific Northwest. But those rankings are not as anomalous as the temperature rankings and are in like the 40s or 50s in terms of the driest years going back to 1895. So I just wanted to quickly recap our snowpack as a reminder. So I showed this exact slide 2 months ago. Our April 1 snowpack was below normal again across the northern areas of the Pacific Northwest. On this map, this is the April 1 percent of median. And then snowpack was looking much better in the southern areas of the Pacific Northwest. So Oregon, for the state as a whole, was 104% of median. Idaho, south of the Salmon River, right near normal at 102% of median, but below normal in the other regions. And of course, it was below normal for a few reasons. It was influenced both by the lack of precipitation, but it was also some warm temperatures and some key times of the year that were warm that actually melted snow mid-accumulation season, particularly in Washington on a few occasions. So because of that, in mid-June, Washington declared a drought, and they have a drought definition written into the state statute. So they are able to declare drought based on current or anticipated conditions being below a threshold of 75% of normal water supply. So for this year, they were really looking at the lack of snow throughout Washington. But there's another key piece of that definition, and that is whether there are expected to be hardships due to that lack of water. So that is why there was a carve out for some of these metropolitan areas in Western King County, Western Snohomish County, and near Tacoma, because the water supply for those areas is looking to be normal and continues to look good because they were able to manage actively throughout the winter to store more water for water supply. There haven't been any other drought declarations made in Oregon or Idaho. I did see that Jefferson County in Oregon requested a declaration in April. It works a little bit different in Oregon, where counties request to the state. And as far as I know, the state has not declared drought for Jefferson County yet. And then none in Idaho. So then, of course, the last 60 days, if anyone's in the Pacific Northwest, you've probably noticed it's been cooler than normal. So despite the water year as a whole being on the warm side, the last, since mid-April has felt cooler than normal, about 1 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit below normal, really throughout the whole region. Precipitation has been different compared to the west of the Cascades to east of the Cascades, where there's actually been some precipitation in western Washington and western Oregon. Really, the rest of the Pacific Northwest has remained on the dry side for the last 60 days. Then I just wanted to show this quickly, that pattern has pretty much remained if you just look at the last 30 days. So just through the end of May. And temperatures have been more anomalous in the last 30 days. So anomalies approaching 4 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than normal in Washington and the Idaho Panhandle and parts of western Montana. Precipitation, this pattern also looks similar to the 60-day one, a little more precipitation in western Washington, northwestern Oregon, much drier on the east slopes of the Cascades. And we are seeing, or we did see, some above normal precipitation throughout Idaho here. Parts of Idaho, I should say. So I just wanted to point out, this is looking specifically at the snowmelt period of our state. So I'll highlight the circle here to show what I'm talking about. But this black line is the average snowpack for the state as a whole. So it's, of course, there's variability within that, but we have Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And what I wanted to point out is, so since about mid-April, since we've entered this cool period, the sort of slope of the line has changed in terms of the melt here for Washington. We're seeing it also a little bit in Oregon and Idaho as well. So the cool temperatures did slow snow melt to some extent. It wasn't a drought buster by any means, and we still saw snow tail sites that melted 1 to 2 weeks early, in some locations even earlier. But the point I wanted to make here is that it wasn't as bad as it could have been, particularly for Washington. We were really looking, so this shading is the percentiles in the historical record. So we were really approaching this red area, so this below normal percentiles or much below normal percentiles, and then kind of those cool temperatures helped this level off a little bit and not be as bad as it otherwise might have been. But with that said, we are seeing some real drought impacts. This is a look at the reservoirs in the Yakima Basin of Washington. The blue line is the current reservoir storage, and it's much below normal, which is the green line, or I'm sorry, the red line. The green line is the previous year. And we've known for a long time in the Yakima Basin that the paradable or the junior water users were going to receive less than their usual water allotment. And in June, they updated that forecast. So the total water supply available for these folks for the April to September period is only 48% of their usual entitlements. So less than half of the usual water that they were expecting to see. And this forecast has gone down over the months. I believe in April, when I talked to you all, it was like 63% or somewhere near there. In March, the month prior, it was 70-something%. So just continued to get worse in terms of their water supply. So there has been applications to the state from this area to try and mitigate some of these impacts from the lack of water supply in the Yakima Basin. Otherwise, taking a wider picture of the Pacific Northwest compared to the last time I presented in April, this is the 28-day stream flow. So stream flows are looking much, much better across western Washington and western Oregon compared to what they were in April. And of course, that's in response. These are mostly rain-dominated rivers, so that's in response to that precipitation we've seen over the last 60 days. But some other parts of the region are in those below normal percentiles for stream flow, some even much below normal there in central Washington, and then a few other spots. The Olympic Peninsula in Washington here is one that we're also expecting to see some drought impacts this year, and they're seeing some low stream flows as well already. Soil moisture, similar improvements especially in western Washington, northwestern Oregon, but still some dry soils popping up in southwestern Oregon, and then especially here in the lower Columbia Basin of Washington, some really dry soil moisture percentiles there. This is the drought monitor on the left-hand side. This is the current drought depiction as of last week. And then on the right-hand side, this is these are the changes we have seen over the last 8 weeks. So again, since about mid-April, last time I talked to you all. And there have been some improvements made, especially in Western Washington and Western Oregon in response to that recent precipitation compared to where we were in April. Some improvements here in Western Montana and in the Idaho Panhandle, but also some worsening drought in Central Washington. So just to wrap up, the 2024 water year to date has featured above normal temperatures with regional variability in precipitation. Over the last 60 days, we have been cool, but also drier than normal has pretty much been the norm. The exception is Western Washington and Western Oregon, where it's been wetter. The cooler temperatures were overall beneficial in slowing snowmelt and delaying the possible onset of more widespread drought impacts. The precipitation west of the Cascades has also helped stream flows and soil moisture. But we are seeing drought impacts, particularly in eastern Washington and parts of the northern Olympic Peninsula. And then I heard from some of my colleagues in Idaho saying that they're really watching closely the Idaho Panhandle since they've had some really dry conditions and they have a lot of non-irrigated agriculture there, so that once the conditions really do turn and stay warmer, they're expecting some drought impacts to emerge in that region. So with that, I'll end and thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. Remember, if you have questions, go ahead and put those in the question box. And I will turn this over to Joe for our outlook.
Great, thank you, Britt, and thanks, Karin, for giving kind of the where we were the last 30 days, 60 days, and water year. I'm going to focus mostly on where we think we're headed. But before I get into that, I wanted to let me give the overview. My first point here is just I wanted to look a little bit more closely at June. And thinking about something I used to hear when I lived in Seattle, which is that summer never starts until July 4th. Then I'll walk through the outlooks, the 8 to 14 day, the monthly outlook for July, the seasonal outlook, and the drought outlook, and then I'll show off what El Nino is doing as it makes its transition to a La Nina phase. So first, this idea of what's happening in June. So my time in Seattle was mostly in the 2000s, and I feel like we always used to joke that June was kind of a false start to spring. However, the time of the last 10 years, things have been a little bit different. So the two images I'm showing here in the upper left, this is the day-by-day anomalies for the last 30 days. And so you can see a lot more colder than normal days than warmer. And just for that last 30-day period, that 30-day period is this is strangely in Celsius, it's from CPC, about a little over 1 degree Celsius below the most recent normal. And if we would then compare this like a climate at a glance to look at June's, 1 degree would put us in this kind of vacant space in the lower right. And in that sense, in the last 10 years, at least and I'm just looking at kind of Western Washington for this one, but as Karin showed, a lot of these conditions have been pervasive across the Northwest. In the lower right of this picture, we don't really have any Junes in the Puget Sound lowlands that were below average. We had a lot of hot Junes, especially 2021, which really sticks out here. And you do have to go back to that time in the 2000s or into the 90s when you saw those false summers, perhaps, or the chilly June conditions. So if you're in the Northwest and saying, yeah, this has really been strangely cold, yeah, you're right. We haven't had a June or a start to summer that looks like this one in probably about 10 years. Okay, moving to the outlooks. So this is the 8 to 14 day outlook from CPC, and the left is the temperature probabilities, and the at right is for precipitation. So you can see kind of the odds leaning towards a continuation of the pattern that we've experienced for the last 30 or 60 days of better odds for below average temperatures and better odds for wet conditions in the northern part of the Northwest, and a little bit of the kind of dry signal or a tilt towards drier in kind of central Oregon and southern Idaho. We go out to July. This is the monthly outlook. Again, temperature, left, precipitation, right. You can see there's not a ton of information on the temperature side, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but we're basically calling for equal chances of warmer than average, colder than average, or near average for temperature for most of the Northwest. And then this kind of bullseye for higher chances for dry around Idaho, western Montana, and some of the eastern parts of Oregon and Washington. On the precipitation side, I don't put a ton of stock into this. It's calling for leaning towards dry in a month that's usually pretty dry. So it'd be hard to find a location in the Northwest that might get on normally more than an inch of rain anyway. So I don't put a lot, a dry anomaly on an already really dry period of time. I don't know if there's a lot of great information there, but the equal chances I think is interesting because usually we're kind of red everywhere in our monthly and seasonal outlooks just because the temperature trend, the decadal trend of warming is so strong. But the CPC forecast is really leaning heavily on the cold sea surface temperature anomalies that are up and down the West Coast. And so you kind of see this strip of equal chances kind of going all the way down the coast. So I think that is kind of an interesting piece of information that we might not have, or the odds are tilting for us to have they're not tilting for us to have a warm summer, which is usually what the trend dictates. Jumping to the seasonal look, you see a very similar picture for the temperatures. For the precip, you see kind of more of that dry, tilting towards dry conditions, moving a little eastward into the Intermountain region with a particular kind of bullseye for maybe a weak monsoon in the Southwest. Okay, if we put together, kind of riffing off of what Karin showed, if we put together both those CPC forecasts as well as our current conditions, we kind of get the ingredients for the drought outlook. And you can see the yellow areas are where we expect drought to emerge, and the brown areas are where drought indicators already have us in drought according to the drought monitor. And you can see a lot of the Washington State, the western parts of Montana, places where drought exists. Drought should be persistent, and we kind of see the extension. And I think a lot of it reflects, the poor snow conditions in these regions that we just don't expect to catch up and eliminate that deficit anytime during the summer. I also wanted to show the fire outlooks. And I apologize, these are a little grainy, but this is for July, August, and September. July and August, I was able to show the North American picture. They haven't issued it for September. They just have the US one. The red regions show above normal fire activity, the green regions below normal, and the white regions normal. I want to point out this is summer, so just because you're in a white region doesn't mean you can't have fire. It's just that you would expect the fire activity to be about close to climatological numbers. You can see for the patterns, at least domestically, look really, really similar. There's a little bit of a green on the map in California from their wet winter, but otherwise we're looking at kind of red areas in western Washington, in southern Idaho and eastern Oregon. And some of that, I think, red splotch there, I think is driven by a lot of probably rangeland growth that we experienced during the winter, and those things kind of drying out. Also of note, I think it's important to see the North American view that we may have some smoke incidences, and it could be not just in the Northwest, but in lots of parts of the United States. There have been fires in Canada that have essentially overwintered, that were smoldering during the winter and now are picking back up. And the region is just so big, and I think their suppression resources are not going to be putting them out. And so I would expect another busy fire season in Canada. Okay, moving to the tropics. This is a picture of sea surface temperatures for mid-May through mid-June, and you can see along the equator, just off the coast of South America, that kind of cold tongue starting to form, and so the conditions to La Nina are kind of creeping in. Officially right now, we are in ENSO neutral conditions, but all the forecast models, as I'll show now, or at least this is a summary of the forecast guidance, have us developing La Nina conditions with the percentages being pretty strong as we get into the end of summer, fall, and winter. So we expect kind of we have officially made it out of El Nino now, and we expect the La Nina conditions to set up shop here in the coming months. And great, I'll turn things over. Thanks so much, Britt, and for everyone else for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. We don't have any questions so far, so we'll go ahead and move to the second half of our webinar. And I'm going to hand over presentation to Rachel. And Rachel will be presenting on a drought and public health roadmap and messaging research for public health providers.
Thanks, Britt. Let's see, are you seeing the right screen?
Yes, we are.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, as Britt said, I'm Rachel Ekadu, and I'm at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And we've been doing a lot of work over the last few years around drought and health and engaging some different stakeholders in that work. So I just wanted to share about some of that work and two of the resources that we've developed through that work. So the first I want to talk about is our drought and health roadmap. So this was a document that we created with Britt and with some of her colleagues at NIDIS. This was the result of work that we did over about a 3 to 4 year period, looking at engaging public health more directly in drought work. And so our intent with this document was to really highlight some of the work that's being done nationally and regionally around drought and health, provide some recommendations for future work, and then hopefully see those recommendations lead to future funding opportunities or other research opportunities as well. So when we conducted these outreach activities that led to the roadmap document, we had two primary goals. The first was to convene stakeholders and include people who weren't normally at the table in drought activities. And so our focus there was primarily around convening public health, healthcare, emergency managers, just some of those different partners who maybe aren't always involved in this work. And our other goal was to assess the needs and gaps that may be a hindrance to doing drought and health work. So the way we went about this is we had kind of a three-pronged approach. We held a national drought and health summit in the spring of 2019. And then we held a series of 6 regional drought and health workshops across the country between 2019 and 2022. And then we also conducted a series of interviews with state health departments across the country. We interviewed about 20 different state health departments to get a sense of what work they were doing around drought and health. So at each of our workshops that we held, the National Summit and then the 6 regional workshops, we concluded each of those workshops by asking a question of what should happen next? What do we need to do now? And so we used the results of those discussions at the workshops, as well as the findings from the interviews of the state health departments to create a series of recommendations. And those recommendations all fell within these 4 focus areas. We have partnership and collaboration, communication and outreach, interdisciplinary research and applications, and planning and preparedness. And one of the things I like when I look at this list is you can see that there's really kind of a theme across all 4 of these areas about bringing people together. It's very much about how do we engage more people, how do we work together better, how do we bring together different disciplines, etc. So we really found that to be the overarching theme across all of these focus areas. So I wanted to share a few examples of recommendations that we had for each of the focus areas, starting with partnership and collaboration. So the #1 recommendation that we heard at every single workshop we conducted and at most of the State Department interviews as well was to build a community of practice. So to have an interdisciplinary body of people who are engaged in drought and health work, who could build the knowledge base in this space, who could share research with each other, because we found that there were a lot of people doing really complementary work, but they weren't necessarily well integrated with each other, or they weren't aware of the work that they were each doing. The second was to expand public health representation at drought-related meetings. It's pretty self-explanatory, but like I noted, we just found that there weren't necessarily those connections between people who were doing public health work and those who were doing drought work. So to invite more public health people to drought-related meetings. Increasing the adoption of early warning systems. We talked a little bit about using centralized health-related data for disease prediction and forecasting, which could help sort of define these early warning signs of the health impacts that we see with drought. We also talked about incorporating drought into vulnerability and community health needs assessments. So by that, we mean not only having public health engaged in drought meetings, but to have drought engaged in public health initiatives like community health assessments. We found that a lot of the public health workforce didn't necessarily think of drought as a health threat. So beginning to include drought more in some of their public health assessments. Moving on to communication and outreach, we found there was a huge need for impact-based communication resources. And by that, I mean very clear educational, plain language materials that could translate the research that's being done and the science that's out there around drought and health directly to the communities who are most impacted. And along the same lines, the second one about tailoring communication tools to vulnerable populations, we found there was a need for more communication tools that were targeted towards either rural or urban populations or people with limited English proficiency or any of the different groups who are at a higher risk of some of the health impacts that we see with drought. We also wanted to increase the drought and health resources available for health departments. As you all are likely aware, just from what we saw with the pandemic, health departments are pretty strapped. They have a low bandwidth right now because they just have a lot on their plate. So the more we can create resources for them that they can use in their communities, I think the more likely they are to actually use those resources. We also had a recommendation to use federal agency websites to share resources. So using things like drought.gov or even CDC websites to share drought and health resources, since those are sites and resources that people may be more readily aware of and more likely to tune into. So the third area that we talked about was interdisciplinary research and applications. So one thing that we really saw come up a lot in the workshops that we conducted was that there wasn't always a clear understanding of which drought indicator to use when. You know, there are so many different drought indices and tools that are used in this space, and so there wasn't always a good understanding of which indicator to use when, and also there wasn't a lot of understanding of what those indicators meant for people who weren't in the climate science space, so creating better understanding there. We also talked about how there really is a need for a stronger evidence base regarding drought and health to improve public health decision making. So one of the ways that we suggested that could be remedied is by conducting a comprehensive review of past drought events and really assessing what were the health effects, what were some of the potential early warning signs, what went well, what didn't go well, etc. We also talked about barriers to data access. If you have ever tried to access public health data, then you know that that can be a bit of a nightmare. But there's also issues with accessing drought data. So finding ways to fund software tools or standardizing different data set types, I think would be really beneficial to promote this interdisciplinary research. And then finally, one of the things that was very interesting for us to see is that in every single region where we did a workshop or where we conducted an interview with a state health department, we heard about this big concern around private wells. They're largely unregulated, and so it's kind of this Wild West space of water quality and water quantity. So we need to have a better understanding of what that exactly looks like so we can communicate suggestions to individuals who have private wells. Our final category was planning and preparedness. These were some of the recommendations we had there. One, making sure we're incorporating health impacts into any drought assessments that are occurring. We found at one of our regional workshops that we hosted that there was a health department representative who was creating a drought assessment, and there was a state climatologist office who was creating a state drought plan, both within the same state, but they weren't aware of each other's work. So really it showed us that there needs to be a better incorporation there of those two groups being able to work together and create a really cohesive drought plan and health assessment. We talked about using tabletop exercises for drought events. If you're not familiar, tabletop exercises are a really common tool in emergency management and emergency preparedness, and they're used a lot for other types of threats like big storms or things that are more acute disasters, but they're not necessarily used for slower moving events like droughts. So we talked about changing that approach to exercising. It was really important to us that there's more discussion and action around engaging with tribal nations and tribal communities. There are unique needs and concerns within those communities that need to be included at all levels of drought planning. And then we also talked about creating sample drought and health questions for community health needs assessments, again, just to alleviate some of the burden on health departments who may be wanting to do work in this space. So for my remaining time, I want to talk real quick about this drought and health messaging framework that we created. So this is a document that was really intended to be a direct response to some of the recommendations from the roadmap. This is intended to be a very practical tool for public health and healthcare professionals focused entirely on drought and health. So this document includes a really high-level overview of drought and some of the potential health impacts there. It includes some partnerships that are suggested for conducting drought response efforts and messaging. It has messaging maps that are based on the different stages of drought from the U.S. Drought Monitor. And then it also has sample communications for public health officials to use with their communities and healthcare providers to use with their patients. And then a couple other key tools for drought response. So just to give you a look at that document, this is how it starts out. It has this kind of initial overview of how does drought affect health? What are we talking about when we talk about drought? Really high level, not too in the weeds, but just kind of the basics that we feel like people in the public health and healthcare workforces need to be aware of. And then these are our messaging guidelines. So you can see here, we give basic tips around risk communication. And then the very first thing we say to do is figure out what stage of drought your community is in. Once you know what stage you're in, you can go to one of these message maps here and see what are some key messages that may be useful to your community. There's even sample language that you can take directly and apply to your health department or healthcare community, whatever the case may be. So again, really wanted this to be an extremely practical and useful tool for folks in public health and healthcare. So at this point, what we're doing is we're kind of testing out that messaging framework, evaluating how it's working for our target audiences. We're hoping to maybe adapt the framework to make it more targeted to specific regions or even states. And then we're also looking at creating additional communication products like this, but for different audiences. So potentially for emergency management or tribal communities or different specific groups. So just to close real fast, just again want to emphasize that public health and healthcare professionals really are key partners in this drought work. They're trusted messengers who can share about how drought is impacting the community from a health perspective. Finding ways to actually create practical tools that translate this important research into something that can be used by the community is really critical. And then I've put here 2 QR codes for each of those documents, the roadmap and the messaging framework, so that you can access those if you'd like to take a look at them. And with that, I'll close. Thanks, Britt.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And I'll also put those links in the chat box. So now I want to turn it over. I do see we have one question for Joe. We're going to save that to the end, but I want to turn it over to Cassie to talk about farm stress, causes, and implications.
I thought I unmuted myself. How does that look?
That looks great.
Okay, thank you. I just want to thank you, Britt, for inviting me to talk about this. We're going to talk about some farm and ranch stress, causes, and then implications, of course. And I'm Cassie Bosky. I work for Oregon State University Extension Service. I'm an agriculture extension agent. I work on the south coast of Oregon in Coos and Curry counties, and we have a lot of specialty crops down here. So I work primarily in cranberries is what I spend most of my time doing. And yeah, so Eisenhower said, farming looks mighty easy when your plow is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles from a cornfield. And I think that is a really accurate thing for those of us who aren't in the farming or ranching industries. It's easy to look at that and think, it's just kind of a idealistic job, idyllic, I guess, and that it's a great lifestyle. And I think people who do this work believe so, but they're also carrying around a lot of extra stressors that those of us who have the typical 9-to-5 work week where we get a paycheck, regular paycheck at the end of every month or twice a month or whatever, don't necessarily have to worry about. So a lot of this just says farming, but I'm including ranching and any kind of agriculture production in here, but it's just easier to say farming. So that's what I mean there. But they've got a lot of stress factors that, like I said, we don't deal with. Market fluctuations are a really big deal, and they don't have a lot of control over these things. A lot of them have very big debt loads, and financial pressures are high. They're dealing with the impacts of climate change, whether that's drought like we're talking about here today, or if it's flooding. There's just a lot of intense events that are happening that can have a very significant impact on their either crop or livestock production. They've reported, actually, we did a survey in Oregon, and they reported that drought and wind were there when they talked about climate and what the most stressful parts of that are. They said it was drought and wind. And then we've got a population that is relatively isolated. They work long days and they live in medically underserved areas. So they may not have access to the kind of healthcare and mental health care that those of us who live in more urban type areas do. And so there's additional risk factors that they're dealing with too. When you look at the financial pressures, you may have had a farm or a ranch in your family for generations. Now you've got market problems. COVID was a prime example and really brought to the forefront that a lot of these industries aren't cost plus industries. They are at the mercy of the market for what the kind of financial compensation they get for their products. and they're not able to build in their expenses. And when fertilizer prices triple, fuel prices double, I mean, it's just, there's a lot of input costs that have gone up dramatically for them, and they don't necessarily see that on the other end coming back to them. Add into that, when we're talking about stress, a culture of rugged individualism, where any sort of admittance or talking about mental health, or maybe being depressed and admitting that to somebody may be looked at as a sign of weakness, or even the person themselves may be unwilling to talk about it or deal with depression or anxiety because of the stigma around mental health issues in this community, and it makes it kind of hard for them to get the help that they need. We know that we all carry stress, we all deal with stress every day, but when we have stressors start to build up and never end, so that it's just chronic stress problem, it results in physical and mental problems in our bodies. And so these are some of the things that can flow out of chronic stress. And ultimately, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, I guess we're talking about it next. Ultimately, you can come, mental health problems can devolve into suicidal thinking, or evolve into suicidal thinking. And that's kind of where we're going to go here in a second. So we look at the nature of ag work in summary, and you've got financial stress is always present. There's pressure to never lose the family business. The work itself is physically and mentally stressful, and the hours are long. It's socially isolating, and they may not have somebody they feel confident confiding in when there are problems. And then you add to this the onset of mood disorders that go untreated and a reluctance to seek help, and you have the formula to set up the necessary conditions for suicidal behavior, which of course is what we want to avoid at all costs. So just kind of shifting gears a little bit and talking about suicide rates across the country, you can see the national rate is 14.5 per 100,000 down there at the bottom. And all these numbers are written in by 100,000. And you can you might be able to see where your state lies on this graph or this table. And what we've seen is that rural areas have higher rates of suicide than do urban areas. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but lack of good access to care is one of them. And this right here, these data right here are the reason why I'm able to do the work I'm doing. Somebody brought these suicide statistics to Congress, and they allocated a bunch of money in the 2018 Farm Bill to do outreach and education around suicide prevention in the agriculture industry. And what you'll see is that the rates of suicide in this particular population is about 3.5 times that of the general population of the US. And if you notice that in that top bullet point, about 48 males per 100,000 in comparison to 11 females per 100,000, there's a difference there. And across the board, when you're talking about suicide statistics, males tend to have a 4 times higher rate of suicide than do females. So this is the reason why this program exists. Part of the outflow of that has been the Western Regional Agricultural Stress Assistance Program, or RASIP. And this is a group of 14 Western states and some territories on the Western US. And basically they've put together a really amazing resource clearinghouse, which you can see at the top of the screen, where if you go there, you can find your state, and it will provide you with a list of the different mental health resources that would be available to you. And you can find this at farmstress.us. Initially, the very first iteration of the Farm Bill project was the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network, and we're underneath that Western Region one. And this is the one we developed at Oregon State University. And here you can find our suicide prevention trainings that we do. We do a lot of those every year. A lot of them are on Zoom. And we provide some other just general resources for education and outreach. about farm stress and suicide prevention. And all of this has been, of course, grant funded, but we provide these trainings and they're called QPR, and that stands for question, persuade, and refer. And what they are basically is an hour to an hour and a half training where we teach you what to watch for in someone who may be struggling with severe stress or even suicidal thinking, what to watch for, and then how to talk to them and get them help. And that's all that training's about. We've got a couple coming up at the end of this summer. We don't usually have many in the summer because of field season. For me, I'm just not able to teach as much, but these are what you can, and you can go to this site right here to find those if you are interested in signing up. We've also, AgriSafe has an agri-stress helpline that's available in 10 states across the US. Oregon, Washington, and Montana are 3 of those states. We've gotten funding to fund this line, and anybody with any sort of question, like if they're stressed, they don't have to be suicidal to call this number. This is something, I've got financial questions, I'm trying to figure this out, and they can call this number and get referred to some resources. So I wanted to make sure I let you guys know about that for when you're out and about and sharing information with people. And maybe I went too fast, so I apologize for that, but basically, we have farmers and ranchers facing serious stressors that can result in physical and mental health challenges. And we talked about what some of those are. Access and stigma are really big in that category. The suicide rate in the ag industry is high, much higher than that of the general population. And then these are some of the resources we have available at this time that you can go to find more information or to help somebody you may know that needs some extra help. And then if you have questions, you can feel free to contact me. That's my phone number and my email. And that's my presentation, Britt.
Great, thank you so much, Cassie. That was perfect. I am going to try to share my screen so that you have, hopefully everyone's seeing that, the email of our speakers today if you have any follow-up questions. We do have a couple questions in the chat box, so I'm going to go ahead and read those. Right now, both of them are for Joe. The first question is, can you comment on the potential implications of the very high sea surface temperatures across the northern Pacific Ocean on summer to fall weather in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, I can give it a shot. You know, Britt, could I share my screen again?
Oh, sure. Yes.
We can pull this off quickly.
Give me 1 second. Okay, it should be this way.
Let's see if I can get the right one. There we go. Okay, so here's the sea surface temperature pattern right now. These are the anomalies yesterday, I guess. So you have this blob of warm water here, and then colder than average along the coast. Not a heck of a lot going on in the Gulf of Alaska, but this is PDO negative. And so we've had that, and here's now the time series, hopefully. We're really in the negative phase, and we've been that way for a while. So as far as making kind of the wintertime predictions, you know, what we have to go on, which is a little flimsy in my, you know, it's kind of like taking a trip to the casino, but you have a building La Nina with PDO negative. And so in general, that tilts your odds to colder and to wetter for a lot of the Northwest and British Columbia. However, if we go and actually look at the real models, and this is summertime. This is a useful page where you can look at what kind of goes into the North America multi-model ensemble, but we can go out to the winter time and look at temperature. This is October, November, December, but you can see in some of it, the you know, kind of combined forecast, we don't have a strong anomaly along the coast. You start to look at individual models, you'll see some that stay cold, and sometimes it's less warmer than average along the coast. So I would say we have a chance to stay maybe not warm, or maybe on a little bit on the cold side, but this forecast is again, a grain of salt when we're talking this many months in advance. But one thing that I think we're fairly sure of, or I have more confidence in saying, is that we're probably going to be PDO negative and have La Nina at the same time. So you can kind of use that for your long-term seasonal predictions / gambling purposes.
Great, thanks, Joe. The second question is, you mentioned that cooler waters off the Pacific coast probably factored into CPC's equal chances temperature prediction for the summer. Do cooler waters also explain why we had an unusually cool June?
Yeah, it probably helped, and I actually would say it's two things. It's not just the coastal cold water, but that warm water offshore helped create a pretty big ridge in kind of the Gulf of Alaska, and so that's created a bit of a trough downstream for the Northwest. And so I think it's that kind of combination. It's not just the cold water along the coast, but actually the combination of warm and cold that's then kind of created the ridge and trough that's kept things a little cooler in the coastal areas of the Northwest.
Great, thanks, Joe. I don't see any other questions coming in, and we are approaching the top of the hour. So if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to our speakers or to us at NIDIS. Please mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will be on August 26th of this year. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you. And thank you so much to all of our speakers.